Throw on some lo-fi girl chill hop music because this is going to be a long, but a good one. What's going on, hybrid shooters? It's Jason Vong. I'm a digital nomad currently visiting New York City right now, and this is how I set up my Sony a7 IV for hybrid shooting. I personally do a lot of photos and videos at the same time, so I optimize my camera into doing both. So I'm gonna go over as much of the relevant settings as I can so that you can better understand what each feature does, and you can set up your camera to the way that you like. And for a lot of you, this is gonna be your first time venturing into the new Sony menu system, and you're gonna find things a wee bit more organized than they were before compared to the Sony a7 III. But this is still a daunting beast to go through. But don't worry, fam, I got you. Now, if you already set up your camera and you just wanna try out my settings, you can actually save what you have right now and come back to it later. Just in case you decide, hey, you like your old way better. Go ahead and press menu and go to the yellow briefcase tab, which is the last option, and select reset and save settings. Save and load settings and go ahead and hit save. If it's grayed out, that means you just need to plug in an SD card. And you can always load back these settings whenever you want, so long as you don't wipe that SD card. So as a matter of fact, why don't you do this right now? Back up your SD card just in case. So as we're going through this together, you might find certain options missing or grayed out, and that's likely because you're in a different mode or you're shooting in a different codec. For example, if you don't see certain video functions, it's likely because you're in photo mode. Or if you don't see 4K 30 frames per second, that's because you're shooting in the XAVC HS codec. I know, it's oddly specific. Now, whenever that happens, just simply flip a few switches and see where that puts you. All right, let's go ahead and set the bottom dial here to photo mode and the top dial here to M, and let's jump right into it. So we'll start off with image quality. Here, I typically leave the first option as JPEG. HEIF stands for high efficiency image format. It's basically higher quality than JPEG, has way more information to it, not as much as RAW, but it still edits better than JPEG. And it's a much smaller file size, which sounds great in theory. But as of now, January 2022, Lightroom and Lightroom Mobile cannot open HEIF. So we will revisit this in the future. Next up, image quality settings. I shoot RAW only nowadays. I don't typically shoot RAW and JPEG anymore because I always process my photos anyway. So if I shoot JPEG as well, it would just take up way too much space for no reason. I would only shoot JPEG if I need to deliver my photos quick, usually after an event like a concert or something. However, feel free to do both if that's what your workflow prefers. But for RAW, we have 3 different options, and you can read up on the differences here on the screen in details, but pretty much, uncompressed RAW preserves all of the data in an image without compression. The main drawback to this is that their file size is incredibly huge. Lossless compressed RAW is a newer format that got introduced and allows you to reduce image size without compromising on quality. Compressed RAW is a lossy compression format that reduces data in a photo. The upside to this is that it doesn't take up that much space. I'm thinking it's probably half the size of a regular uncompressed RAW file. However, don't let that scare you. Personally, I've been shooting with compressed RAW for the last 5 years, and I find to have more than enough information to work with. It's still RAW at the end of the day. There's still a ton of color data to pull from, and it's gonna allow you to shoot 10 frames per second, while the other ones will cap you at 6 frames per second. But if you do shoot a lot of things that tend to have really fine details, like astrophotography for the stars, or a lot of shadows in your landscape photo, uncompressed RAW would be fantastic for things like that. It will be able to pull back up a lot of those shadow information out. Now, lossless compressed RAW is newly introduced within the last year or so, and I'm gonna try this out. As you would suspect, it does take the best of both worlds, but it will write to your card a bit slower, so probably don't want to use this for high action stuff, especially when you need to be bursting down on your shutter. Since I don't do a lot of high action stuff, I can give this a go. For aspect ratio, it only really affects JPEG, but leave it at 3:2 anyways. We'll go ahead and skip the video file format for now. We'll come back to this later when we switch over to the dial for movie mode. But APS-C Super 35 shooting. I turned this off. I just like to be able to toggle this on and off, which I'll set a custom button for later. This feature is more advantageous for video shooters, which I'll explain why in a bit. I wouldn't recommend this for photo shooters unless you're using an APS-C lens. In that case, you can use this feature to crop out the vignetting. Using this with full frame lens will simply just reduce your 33 megapixels down to 15 megapixels. If you really need to crop into your photo, I would suggest doing it in post rather than doing it in the camera. That way, when you change your mind, you still have the full photo to work with. Long exposure NR. NR stands for noise reduction, and I would turn this off because if we do any type of long exposure photography and this is on, this will delay us from taking our next shot because it takes time for it to apply the noise reduction to the photo. High ISO noise reduction. This is grayed out for me because it only affects JPEG. If I shoot in JPEG and need to deliver quickly, it wouldn't hurt to have it on low. Color space, sRGB, and lens compensation, I personally keep all of this on auto. All right, moving on to the second thing on the list, media. So format has been moved up to this section here, so just keep that in mind. Moving on to record media settings. Here's where we can sort where our photo and video files go. You can have one card just receiving all the photos and the second card to house all your video files, or write RAW only to one, JPEG to the other, or you can even have redundant recording which writes to both cards at the same time. The preference is really up to you. So I just keep it on standard, so everything just writes to one card first, and with auto switch media on, it would just write to the next card once the first card fills up. Really handy for video shooters who are recording long hours of footage because it will immediately pick up where it left off if you have this option here, the auto switch media on, and it will just automatically record to the second card. Coming down to number 3, file. So for file settings, you can actually change the file name of your photos here, which may be a great idea if you use multiple Sony cameras. That way you don't run into issues where you accidentally have the same file name when you offload everything to one folder. For folder name, I actually use the date form format, so it will create separate folders for each of the days that I take photos. Number 4, shooting mode, memory recall stuff. We'll have to touch up on this later in the video or the next video. The next thing on the list is 5, USB streaming. I would do HD 1080p 30 if you plan on using this as a webcam for meetings or streaming. Just make sure that you have a USB-C 3.2 cable along with a computer that can support USB-C 3.2, because otherwise you would only be able to use the 720p option here. I personally wouldn't use the 4K 15 frames per second for USB streaming. If you want to simultaneously record the stream to your memory card, you can also enable here in the second option. Now, even though the webcam functionality is built into the camera, if you're professionally streaming on Twitch or YouTube, I would still highly recommend getting a dedicated capture card, something like an Elgato 4K Cam Link. It's just going to be so much better. You're not restricted to just 1080p or a USB-C 3.2 limitation. The HDMI throughput is so much better, and I'll link a video that I did for Sony on this matter in a description box below. Next up, number 6, drive mode. We'll come back to this since this pertains to actually shooting with the camera, but I do want to point out the interval shoot function here really quickly. This is going to be our main time-lapse feature here, where we can create the highest quality time lapses because it's actually taking a series of RAW and or JPEG images, which you can then stitch together with a software like LR Timelapse. Now, the camera doesn't actually stitch together a time lapse for you. You'll have to do this in an editing software on your computer, but this is why you actually have a lot of control, because you can actually edit a series of RAW or JPEG images and create really high quality 8K or 10K time lapses. This is more for the passionate time lapse enthusiasts, and I'll show you later in the video how to create easier 4K time lapses, albeit slightly lower quality than what you would get from the interval shoot function. All right, so moving on to number 7. Shutter and silent. Silent mode settings, I would leave this off for now, and we will set up a quick function menu to trigger it when we need it. But this is super nice to be discreet, especially when you're shooting something that requires absolute silence, like a music recital or behind the scenes for a movie set. Now, for everything else, I probably wouldn't shoot in silent mode. If you notice something wonky in your photos, this will be the first thing that I check. Shutter type, we'll just leave as is. We'll do mechanical. If we shoot in silent, it will automatically switch to electronic. Front curtain shutter, I have this on, enable, anti-flicker set. If you shoot a lot of indoor stuff like indoor sports and notice some weird colors in your photos due to lighting, you can try enabling this to see if there's some improvement to your photos. But for the rest of us, we'll just leave this off and alone. Number 8, image stabilization. Steady shot, yes. Steady shot adjustment, auto. We'll go ahead and skip over the zoom for now. We'll talk about it in the video settings later. Number 10, shooting display. We'll be programming grid line displays to a quick function button later, but for now you can choose which grid line type you like. Personally, I like the diagonal plus square grid since I do a lot of symmetry for photography and video gimbal shots. Now, the last thing here in this section is the live view display settings, and I would honestly leave this alone, but just in case you've changed anything, just double check yours if it matches up with mine. You want to make sure live view display setting is turned on because you want to be able to see the exposure change happening in real time as you're changing your settings, because otherwise you might as well go back to shooting with a DSLR instead of using a mirrorless camera. Because, you know, the joke is you don't actually know what your photos will look like until you take it on a DSLR. Anyways, old timer joke. Let's switch to video mode on the dial now and go through some of the exclusive features that pertain only to movie shooting. Now, one important thing about video, if you plan on shooting really high quality videos, I'm talking about anything 4K 10-bit, you will need to buy a high-end memory card, something that has at least 260 write speed. Otherwise, you'll get this warning right here and it will not capture any video footage. I personally use the Sony Tough cards and they work great, but if you bought one of these prior to June 2020 and you run into this error on your camera right here, you will actually need to send your card into Sony for a replacement before March 31st, 2022. So you better chop chop. I've also tried this SanDisk Extreme Pro with similar specs and it works great too. Though both cards cannot do XAVC SI, 4K 60, 10-bit 422 in S&Q mode only, but it's not a big concern as it's only in S&Q mode. You can do XAVC SI, 4K 60, 10-bit 422 in regular video mode. Now, if you have mid-end to lower tier SD cards, you'll probably want to shoot in XAVC S 8-bit until you upgrade your cards. So video file format, I personally do XAVC HS4K because it uses the new HEVC or the H.265 codec, and this creates much smaller file sizes while still hitting the best video quality. It's gonna be fantastic for YouTube and other internet videos. Bear in mind though, in this codec, you cannot do 4K 30, so if you deliver in this frame rate often, go back to XAVC S instead. Now, if you find your editing software struggling to edit XAVC HS, it might have issues decoding depending on how old your machine is. So if that's the case, you can go back to XAVC S 4K, which is the H.264 codec. That's the same one that you're used to if you're coming from the A7 III or some of the other older Sony cameras. The latest Intel Mac and M1 Macs, along with some of the latest NVIDIA graphics card, can handle H.265 10-bit 420 without much of an issue. XAVC SI 4K is the 600 megabits all intra recording, which is the highest video quality you can shoot in, but it does create large video files, which makes sense because it's recording a lot of data per frame. This will be for pros who do a lot of commercial work, working in films, just really needing to color grade the footage that they produce. And you will need a really high-end memory card to shoot in this format. So if you're just shooting fun home videos or for the internet, you don't need to be shooting in the SI codec. Moving on to movie settings. Record frame rate, pretty self-explanatory. I typically do 24p for all the talking stuff and use 60p for slow motion stuff. As you might know, for the A7 IV, if you want to shoot in 4K 60, it forces you into the APS-C Super 35 crop mode, which is kind of a bummer. Unfortunately, you cannot do 4K 60p in full frame mode, so if you really needed that in full frame, get either the A7S III or the A1. Those two cameras can actually do full frame 4K 60 and also 4K 120 as well, so very worth it to get those cameras in my opinion. But anyways, record settings. You have an option to select how much information you want recorded for bitrate, color info, and depth for videos. Now, I know that sounds super complicated, but basically, if you ever heard of 10-bit 422 and how much of a big deal that is, this is why. You would want to select the highest possible. So for 4K 60, the highest is going to be 200M 10-bit 422. You would want to use this if you're really planning on color grading your footage. Like I'm talking about really changing up your colors here. This will, however, take a toll on your machine as we discussed earlier, but I did find the new M1 Pro and Max MacBook Pros to handle the 10-bit 422 XAVC HS 4K videos to work fine in the Final Cut Pro 10, but you'll likely need to create proxy video files to have a smoother editing experience for any other machines, really. Now, I personally don't do too much color grading, so I'm okay with the next best option, 10-bit 420, which is still more than enough to mess with the colors. Like I mentioned earlier, the latest Intel Macs and the M1 Macs, along with some of the latest NVIDIA graphics card within the last couple years, can handle H.265 10-bit 420 without too much of an issue. Now, if you've chosen XAVC-S earlier, you will see 8-bit 420 options as well. Again, if you find out your computer is struggling to edit 10-bit stuff and you don't do much color grading whatsoever, it is okay to use 8-bit 420 XAVC-S codec. Whew, that was a lot of lettering. Moving on to S&Q settings. Now, S&Q stands for slow and quick, and it's one way to do slow motions and time lapses. This will play back the video in real time with no audio capture. Although it's not capturing at the highest possible quality, it is still extremely good. Still fairly high quality, tons better when you compare this to the previous A7 III. S&Q on the older Sony cameras, to be honest with you, weren't that great. However, now it's super viable on the newer Sony cameras. This is going to be the fastest way to produce slow motion and time-lapse results. Now, quick note. If you choose to do slow motion in S&Q, remember it does not record the audio. I would still recommend recording 4K 60p in regular movie settings and just slow it down in post, because that way audio is still captured, which can be a lifesaver for pros. So for slow motion, have a recording frame rate at 24p, frame rate 60p. That way it slows the footage down by 2.5 times. Recording setting, like I mentioned earlier, 10-bit 420 is good enough. 10-bit 422 may require a higher end SD card. For time lapses, record frame rate 24p again, but for frame rate, we're gonna set this to 2 frames per second. Record setting, same deal. This time lapse method is great because it outputs a 4K video once you're done. Proxy recording. I'm not gonna enable this, but this pretty much records a lower res video file in conjunction with your high quality video file. So if you do proxy editing, this will save you time and the trouble of having to render it in your editing software. Next up, APS-C Super 35 shooting. This crops into your sensor 1.5 times to resemble an APS-C camera. This is great if you have APS-C lenses and you want to use it on your full frame camera. This will just crop the vignetting out. Or if you're using full frame lenses, this will give you an extra reach. For example, if you're using a 24-70 lens and you enable Super 35 mode, congratulations, you just converted your lens into a 35-105 lens. This math comes from me multiplying 24-70 times 1.5 times, which gives us 35-105. Anyways, this gives video shooters a huge advantage because we now have a further reach with no quality loss. So that is insanely helpful. Coming down to lens compensation again. This time around, video shooters have a new thing called breathing compensation. And I would have this on. It's mainly for video shooters, and it's especially important to those who do a lot of cinematic work. This crops into your frame a bit, but it minimizes the focus breathing that we get from certain photography lenses. Now, this is only compatible with most Sony first-party lenses. It may not and likely will not work with third-party lenses like Tamron or Sigma. Let's move on to number 3, file settings. I like to have my file name format with the date and the title. And the title name, I just like to select a different letter because, again, I shoot with multiple Sony cameras. It'll be easier to differentiate where each footage comes from. And we're gonna skip down to number 7, audio recording. For audio record level, by default, it's 26. This is okay to use if you're not using any external mic. It'll just capture sound from the built-in mic. I typically would set this between 12 to 15 if I'm using a shotgun mic, and around 5 to 7 if I'm using a lav mic. Every mic requires different input settings, so I would test out which level is right for your mic. If it's hitting the red often, it means it's too loud. You want to stay between -12 to -3 decibel. Next, I would make sure wind noise reduction is turned off. If it's on, it'll make your audio sound like it's underwater, and we don't want that. And for audio level display, we want that on because we want to see the audio meters running when we shoot our videos. TCUB, this section here pertains to timecode, which I don't personally use, so I'll go ahead and skip. Image stabilization. We'll be setting a quick function menu for this later, but for stabilization, we have standard and active stabilization. Standard stabilization offers some shake compensation to your footage, which is nice for handheld videos. Active stabilization crops into your footage by 10% in exchange for more stable footage. Now keep in mind though, this feature works best with Sony lenses. Third-party lenses like Sigma and Tamron won't be able to take full advantage of active stabilization. Zoom. We'll change the zoom range to clear image zoom, and this is incredibly handy for video shooters, which I'll show you how to do it later. Moving on to shooting display, emphasize record display. I have this on. This just puts a giant red outline on your LCD screen to let you know that you're recording. Just a nice visual aid to have in case you sometimes forget to hit the record button on the camera. I hate to admit this, but it has happened to me quite often, so it's just nice to be able to see that I'm actually rolling on the camera. Marker display. This is different from grid lines. A lot of Sony cinematic shooters love the 2:3:5:1 aspect ratio. It just makes it look more like movies that we would see in the theater. So the marker display helps us frame our shots properly if we choose to deliver in this aspect ratio. All right, moving on. Exposure and color. So the first thing we'll see is exposure. And for the ISO, we'll just leave it auto for now. ISO range limit set. If you shoot auto ISO often, you can actually designate a certain ISO that the camera will never cross. So while this camera can shoot as high as 204,800, I personally wouldn't publish a photo or shoot a video with that high of an ISO anyway. So I'm comfortable with up to 12,800 and honestly wouldn't push further than that. So choose what you're comfortable with. If you're not sure, just leave it alone for now. Number 2, exposure comp. Honestly, I would leave this all alone, but for the exposure step, just make sure it's at 0.3. Number 3, metering. I have it on multi. Phase priority and multi metering is on. Spot metering is on center. And AEL with shutter is set to auto. AEL stands for auto exposure lock, and again, I would just leave this alone. For the flash section, we'll completely skip. I don't do too much flash photography. Number 5, white balance. I would just leave this on auto, standard, and off. And color tone. So color tone is all about personal preference. Personally, I like to have the dynamic range optimizer on and on auto. I know some video shooters don't like having this on, but I personally like the slight HDR effect it gives off where my shadows are a bit brought up and my highlights are a bit lower to help create a more balanced visual. 90% of my YouTube videos are shot this way and I think it looks great. Creative look. So I've been using creative look on standard with dynamic range optimizer on auto for the last 4 years for both photos and videos. And I personally think it looks the best for straight out of camera, true to life colors. No color grading necessary. Within the last couple of years, Sony have made tweaks to their color science and it's been looking better and better with every camera release. So this is probably the best yet. And I've been seeing other video shooters starting to use the same setting as well when they need to deliver videos quickly without having the trouble to grade SLOG first. They might have a few tweaks to their sharpness, contrast, and shadows and whatnots, but I leave it all alone. But in case you do want to experiment, there are also other new creative look profiles that you can experiment with as well. Picture profile. But if you still want to shoot in a log profile, you still can, and it's even better now with the A7 IV. And that's because we have 10-bit 422. Even 10-bit 420 will be okay if your computer can't handle 10-bit 422, but oh my God, working with SLOG and hybrid log gamma is just so much better now with the A7 IV. And we now also have the new PP11S Cinetone profile, which is supposed to mimic Sony's best cinematic color profile, the Venice Color Science. You can give that a shot. I've tried it. I think it's cool, but I still prefer the vibrant look of standard, creative look, no picture profile, dynamic range optimizer on auto look. The pan Jason Vong picture profile, the no picture profile standard look. Anyways, zebras we'll be skipping. It's not really needed for photography, but for video shooters, you guys will probably have use for this to gauge overexposure in certain areas on your screen. Moving on to focus now. Number 1, autofocus, manual focus. Focus mode we will touch on later, but just keep it on continuous autofocus for now. We'll leave these two on balance emphasis. Tracking sensitivity 3, standard. Autofocus illuminator, I would turn this off. This actually turns off the red beam that comes out in the dark to help with focusing, which can be very distracting if you're shooting an event. We will leave this alone. Autofocus with shutter. I leave this on. I like half pressing my shutter to focus. Others like to do back button focusing. So if that's you, turn this off and utilize the AF on button as your focus activator. Pre-autofocus, we'll leave that off. Focus area, we'll leave this on wide for now. We'll go over this later. Focus area limit. Now this is nice because this takes away certain focus area options that you may never use. Over time as you shoot, you'll find out which ones you'll use the least often and can turn it off then. Switch vertical and horizontal autofocus area. Now if you go back and forth between horizontal and vertical shooting, this is just helpful leaving the focus point or the area where they are in the different orientations. I love using this for concerts because I like having zone focusing at the top in the vertical orientation to get the artist's face, and the medium spot tracking focus in the horizontal orientation to keep up with the action. Focus area color, just like your choice in wine, you can either have it red or white, but this is for focus aid, so I like to have it white. You can have it as red. And we will skip the rest of these and leave them in their default settings, except the autofocus frame movement amount. We'll change that to large because this will help move the focus point a lot faster across the screen. Moving on to the next section, this all pertains to face and eye autofocus. So we'll have this on and we will have the subject as human for now. And we'll set up a button to turn off face and eye autofocus later. But for subject, we now have an option between humans, animals, and now birds. And guess what? All of this now works in video mode as well, which is dope. In the previous A7 III and some of the older Sony cameras, you have continuous face and eye autofocus for humans, but you don't have eye autofocus for animals in video mode, but you can do that now in the A7 IV, so that is pretty cool. Subject selection settings. If you don't shoot a lot of animals or birds, or you don't shoot a lot of humans, you can actually remove it from your options if you want. But personally, I like leaving them all on in case one day I decide to shoot some birds. With the camera, that is. Right and left eye select. I will leave this on auto. This prioritizes which eye the camera focuses on and based on the subject's point of view, and we will program a button for this later. Face and eye frame display, just have this on. I like to know if I have the face and eye autofocus enabled and if it's working. Face and memory registration faces, we will skip. This is helpful if you're shooting a wedding or an event and need to focus on a very specific VIP person. It's a pretty self-explanatory setup if you want to give that a shot. For focus assistant, we'll keep this all as is. And number 5, peaking display. This is more for video shooters who do a lot of manual focusing and they will know what to do with this. It's pretty self-explanatory. There's the new focus mapping feature that got introduced to the Sony A7 IV, so you might want to try that first over the peaking to see which one works better for you. Let's switch over to video mode for a quick sec. In video mode, we have 2 focus settings we need to be aware of: autofocus speed and sensitivity. And we'll also be programming these to the quick function menu later, as these are essential for video. This is different from the vague, slow, normal, and fast that we saw on the A7 III. We now have finer controls over how the autofocus works on the A7 IV. So autofocus speed controls how quickly it needs to grab something in focus, 7 being the fastest, 1 being the slowest. I typically find 2 to be very nice for those slow rack focusing shots between the 2 objects, but I personally keep it around 3 to 5 for most of what I do. Autofocus sensitivity controls how sensitive the focus shifts to a different subject, 5 being the most responsive. So immediately if something came into your frame, even for a brief second while you already focus onto something else, it will shift focus to the new subject anyway. So it's very ADD. Vice versa, 1 being very locked on. So even if something else came into frame, your camera will stay locked onto your initial subject unless the new subject that came into frame stood in front of your old subject long enough, then it will shift focus to the new subject. Coming down to Focus Assistant, Focus Map is newly introduced to the A7 IV, and it's a new and alternative way to gauge focus as opposed to using focus peaking. Here's how it works. Whatever is not covered in color squares is what's in focus. Anything in blue is behind depth of field, and anything red is in front of depth of field. Pretty neat, eh? But a quick note though, this only works in video mode. All right, we're on a playback tab now, and we're gonna come down to magnification, and we're just gonna make sure enlarge position is focus position, so that'll be super helpful to double check the focus quickly because it embiggens the spot where you'll have to focus. That's an interesting word that I use on the script, embiggen. Selection and memo ratings. We'll talk about rating your photos later because we'll be making a custom button for that. Delete. Make sure delete confirm is cancel first because it gives a warning before it deletes a photo, which is always a good idea to have on. And I think that's it for now. We're actually gonna be skipping the green globe section entirely for today. And we're gonna come straight down to the yellow briefcase. So for Operation Customize, we'll also come back to this shortly since we're gonna be spending a lot of time with this. So come down to different set for stills and movies first. Now, this is key for hybrid shooters because you can have entirely different settings for photos and for videos. For example, in video mode, you can be in SLOG 3 picture profile with your shutter speed at 1/125, aperture 4.0, ISO at 800 in video mode, and then flip to photo mode and be in no picture profile with completely different aperture and shutter speed settings when you flip-flop. So it's not quite like memory recall, if you remember that from the A7 III. This is going to be based on whatever is the most recent settings you have for photo and video mode. And I would just check all of the boxes. Record with shutter, I would have this on. This would just make your shutter button into another record button when you're in movie mode. So for touch operation, I would leave whatever is on default. But for touch function and shooting, make sure this is touch tracking. This will place a tracking box on a subject and keep it locked on it as you're shooting, which works really well. Accessibility, the screen reader actually reads out the menu to you, which is pretty cool. So this is the first I've seen on any Sony cameras. Moving on, Finder and Monitor. The only one I would make a mention of will be the monitor brightness. If you switch this to sunny weather, it actually makes the screen brighter, which is incredibly helpful when you're shooting in broad daylight outdoors. Aside from that, and we're actually gonna make a custom button for the monitor brightness, but aside from that, will come down to power settings. For power save start time, I have it on 5 minutes, so my camera will go into sleep mode after 5 minutes of inactivity. Power save by monitor, I have it as both linked. This pretty much means when you close the monitor with the screen facing towards the camera, it will just put it into sleep mode, and when you pop open the screen back on, it would just power on the camera again. But this one right here is probably the most important one, the auto power off temperature. Set this to high because it's gonna allow you to record videos for a long period of time, even if it gets too warm. The A7 IV does have better thermal cooling than the A7 III, so it should dissipate heat a lot better. But you would still wanna have this on high so you don't have to worry about it stopping recording in the middle of things. And in my experience, as well as a lot of other video shooters' experience, there hasn't been a negative side effect to leaving this on high. Sound option, the only thing to pay attention here is the audio signals, which makes the record sound whenever you start and stop recording. I personally like to have this on so I know the recording is triggered, but if you need to be subtle, turn this off. USB settings, leave all as is. For external output, one major thing to pay attention here is the HDMI display info. Make sure to have this off, especially for video shooters who use external recorders like the Atomos Ninja. This is how you're gonna get a clean video feed, because otherwise you'll be recording all of your camera menu settings as well as the video footage, and you do not want that for your Atomos Ninja. For me, I have it on because I am intentionally recording the camera screen so you can see what I'm doing here, but turn it off otherwise. And finally, setup options. There's this new thing called the anti-dust function. They introduced this to the A9 Mark II, and this was huge requests from Sony to include a feature like this where the shutter closes when the camera is off to prevent dust from going into the sensor when we switch out lenses. So they finally included it to some of the more recent Sony cameras. So if you choose to turn this on, just make sure to never ever touch a shutter, because otherwise it's gonna be a costly repair. By the way, I hope you guys are enjoying this guide. If you can just do me a quick favor, this free tutorial was actually made possible by my sponsor, Squarespace. They support small creators like myself so that we can keep putting out resourceful videos like this one on the internet. I'm sure you heard by now, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to create beautiful websites. No coding knowledge required. Simply select from their many clean and customizable designs that best fits your needs. Whether it's for a photography portfolio, a resume, or an online storefront, design it with Squarespace. Try it out for yourself right now with a 14-day trial. The link's in the description box below. See if you like it, and if you do, use my link or code JasonVong to save 10% off your website or domain. Thank you so much for listening. It means a lot to me. Now back to the video. Whew! How you doing? You need a water break? You know, it's not a bad idea to do some stretches right now, because this next part here is gonna be a beast. So let's go ahead and move on to button customizations now. This section pertains to the features we'll be programming to the custom buttons on the camera. Now, you're gonna notice a lot of my buttons and my quick function settings stay pretty consistent in both photo mode and in video mode, even if one of the settings works better in one mode compared to the other. For example, my C3 button here is the Super 35 toggle. Like I mentioned throughout the entire video, it's best for video shooters only, but I still made the C3 button in photo mode a Super 35 toggle as a precaution in case I swap to Super 35 mode in video mode and forgot to change it back. Rather than having to go back to video mode to change it, I can just change it in photo mode. Having customization tailored to each mode is great, but having too many varying ones will cause a lot of confusion when we're shooting in the field, and we don't want that. We'll start off with a quick function menu first. As you can see here, it is separated by photo mode and video mode. This is great because you can see that certain photo functions don't necessarily apply to video and vice versa. So depending on which mode you're going to be in, either of these will be the first option on the list, whether it's shutter for photo or audio record level for video. On the other hand, things like focus mode, focus area, and white balance, they're all used in both modes, so we have them mirroring each other so we can always find these specific settings exactly where they are, regardless of which mode we're in. And certain settings are also placed here to act as visual aid for us to be reminded which settings we're in so we can make changes on the fly to avoid making mistakes. So let's run down photo mode first. Top row from left to right, we got shutter type, and this controls your single shot, high-speed burst shots, self-timer, and bracketing. Focus mode, this switches between the different autofocus and manual focus modes. I'm usually on autofocus continuous and manual focus. If you're shooting static subjects, you might want to consider autofocus single for the sharpest results. DMF is another form of manual focusing, except the camera autofocus first, and then you can turn your focus ring to adjust focus manually. Focus area. This switches between the different focus points, wide, zone, center, spot, as well as expandable and tracking. By the way, I have an old but still very relevant video going over how I use the different focus areas effectively if you want to learn more. But I'll also be coming out with a 2022 version sometime very soon, so subscribe to the channel and stay tuned. Anyway, in addition to these focus areas, if you have also set up touch tracking focus, you can use that to track focus on a moving subject. Wide, zone, center, spot, and touch tracking autofocus are the ones that I use the most. White balance, self-explanatory, choose the right one to match the color of the scene. Grid options. This cycles through the different grid options available to us, and we will later program the down button to toggle the display on or off. And number 6 here is creative looks, and this is sometimes for if I'm feeling a little frisky and want to change up how my video looks. Now we are at the bottom row, going from left to right. Silent shutter. Here we can turn off the shutter sound when we take photos. Next up here is subject selection, which switches between human, animal, and bird eye AF. Right and left eye selection. Now this is extremely great for portraits, especially when you're shooting at a wide open aperture at like f1.2 or something. Sometimes you might just find the camera choosing the wrong eye on its own. Wrong eye. Okay, what I mean by that is sometimes the camera might choose an eye that is being blocked by hair or something and it focuses on the hair instead. That wouldn't be ideal. So this allows us to change it to the other eye that's not obstructed to get the eye in focus. Number 10, face and eye autofocus toggle. This turns off face and eye autofocus, which is great for when you're shooting landscape or architecture, but there are people in it. You don't want the camera to be focusing on people's faces when that happens. Number 11, Super 35 toggle. Now this is completely redundant, but I will have this program in the C3 button, which you'll see later, but this acts as a second visual aid. You can tell if you're in Super 35 mode on the corner here, but sometimes when we get too caught up in shooting, we can easily overlook it. The last thing that we want is to go home, offload the photos to our computer, just to find out that we shot all of our photos in crop mode. Oftentimes, we will need to access the quick function menu, so this acts as a good reminder to check if we're shooting in full frame mode or in Super 35 mode. And our last one here on the corner is picture profile, self-explanatory. Coming down to video section now. Number 1, audio record level. This controls your input level, how loud you want to capture your sound. And since the rest of these are the same as photo mode, we'll skip all the way down to autofocus speed and sensitivity here on the bottom row. So we have autofocus speed here and autofocus sensitivity right next to it. Now these two settings here are essential for video shooters because we need to control how fast and how sensitive our focus changes. So having these easily accessible would just make our lives so much easier. Number 9, steady shot. This allows us to toggle between active, standard, and no stabilization. Number 10, face and eye autofocus. This is just nice to have to toggle off. Number 11 is a marker display, and number 12 is picture profile, which we can cycle through SLOG, hybrid log gamma, and Cinetone right here. Now let's get into the buttons, and we're gonna go up to custom key dial set for video first actually, because by default it is set to follow everything in photo mode, but we don't want that for one big reason. In case we choose to program some of the buttons differently in photo mode later down the line, it will also cause our video ones to change as well, and it can have unintended consequences. Rather than realizing that during an important shoot, it is best to just sort it out now. So we're gonna change everything here, even if some of the options are gonna be the same as the one in photo mode. You can follow how I set it up here on the screen, but I'm gonna go over why I set them up the way that they are. Number 1, AEL toggle. AEL stands for auto exposure lock. Now, toggle is different from hold. Hold means you have to keep holding it down for it to work. Toggle just turns it either on and off until you press it again. Now, the way that I shoot, I often shoot in auto ISO a lot. Rather than setting my ISO every time I point at something different with a slight change in lighting, I let the camera choose for me first, and then I lock it down with this button right here. So as I'm moving around during the same take, my exposure won't change, keeping things looking very consistent. And you can tell if you have the AEL toggle on by this white star right here that appears on the bottom right corner of the screen. Number 2, the AF on button here on the camera. That is my autofocus manual focus toggle. Same idea here. I would let my camera grab focus on something first, and then I hit the toggle button here so my focus won't keep changing. It's really handy for these gimbal parallax movement shots where I need to slide out of a foreground to review something in the background. Number 3, which is the C1 button here, this is where I can change my focus area. Number 4, the C3 button here is my Super 35 mode, which we talked about earlier. It crops into the frame 1.5 times to give an extra reach with our lenses, or crops away the vignetting when we're using APS-C lenses. And number 5, which is the C4 button here, the trash can button on the bottom of the camera here, this is clear image zoom. This allows you to zoom and get an extra bit of reach without compromising on the quality. This is best with 4K videos, especially with the A7 IV. This camera oversamples 7K footage, so it's not gonna harm your footage in any way if you do clear image zoom while you're shooting in 4K. Moving on to the next page, rear 2. Our first option here is focus standard. This is where your joystick is, and the joystick allows you to move the focus point around. But this option here is helpful when you're using smaller focus point and quickly need to center it back to the screen. Just press down on the joystick right here and it will move that smaller focus point back to the middle. Number 2, monitor brightness, which I've set to this middle button right here that is inside of the wheel. You can toggle between manual and sunny weather, which can help make your screen brighter or dimmer. And this is incredibly useful, especially for video shooters. It makes the monitor brighter so we can see it in a brighter environment. Now, unlike the A7 III, this doesn't hyper exaggerate the color and the exposure, so you're not fooled into thinking that you might be overexposing your footage. Number 3, which is the left button right here, and I set that as the focus map. Number 4 on the right is the ISO. I'm just keeping with the label on the camera here so I don't get confused. And number 5, the down button right here, is the grid display toggle, which when I press it will bring up the grids. Moving down to the next page, this focuses on the 2 buttons here on the top. The first one is movie shooting. Number 2 is focus magnifier, and this is useful because it allows you to punch in to check focus really quickly if you're using a manual focus only lens, or if you've toggled to manual focus and just need to double check really quickly if you're in focus. I do this a lot when I'm using a macro lens. I typically never let the macro lens autofocus. I would just do the manual focusing by myself. Or if I'm shooting with lenses that has really good minimum focusing capability, like the Tamron and Sigma lenses. Moving down to lens, and I just kind of leave it as focus hold since I don't own a lot of lenses that has a lens button on it, but feel free to change it to whatever you like. Coming down to the next page, dial and a wheel, and I pretty much leave this all as is. The third option here is exposure compensation. There used to be markings on the furthest out here, but for the A7 IV, they decide to take that out because they are allowing you to change it to whatever you like in case you don't want to use the exposure compensation. But I personally do, so I'm keeping it there. And number 4, ISO, which I can just turn the wheel here on the back to adjust ISO on the fly. Now let's go to photo mode. And a lot of it's gonna be similar to what we've already programmed in video mode. Again, we're going for consistency here to avoid confusion while we shoot. So rear one, the first 4 options here are the same. Just make sure for AEL and the autofocus manual focus, it is toggle and not hold. But number 5 here, since we can't use clear image zoom in raw photo mode, I made this to switch right and left eye for portrait purposes. Moving down to rear 2, let's see here. Focus standard the same, monitor brightness the same. Number 3, drive mode. This is already defaulted drive mode, so I just kept it the way it is since it's labeled on the camera as drive mode anyways. Number 4, same thing, ISO. Number 5 is grid display, same thing. Coming down to the top, number 1, I kept it as movie shooting, just in case, you know, I'm doing photography and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, that's a good shot for a video. I just have to hit this button and start rolling rather than having to turn the dial and press the record button. That would be a 2-step process, while this would be just 1. And number 2, here I put switch to silent mode. It's a quick way to just start going stealth, undetected, start blasting away without being noticed. Coming down to lens, again, I just leave as is because I don't own a lot of lens that has a button on it. And custom key and dial, same thing, I leave all as is. The third option is exposure compensation, and my last option here is the ISO. Coming down to playback customization, and there really isn't much. Number 1 is select playback media, which is the C1 button right here. And this just allows us to switch between card 1 and card 2 if we need to find a certain photo or video between the cards. Number 2 is the C3 button right here, and I have it as a rating. When I'm setting this up, I only enable 1 star. Having multiple stars doesn't actually allow me to sort any faster, so 1 star is enough to let me know that, hey, I love this photo a lot. So when I offload it to my computer, I can find that starred photo a lot faster and start editing them right away. And if you're curious about this whole process, I actually have a video on how I optimize my Sony workflow. So you can click up here to check it out, or find that video in the description box below. But anyways, number 3, this is the function button right here. And this just sends photos and videos to our phone if we have the Imaging Edge app. And that's pretty much it. Now, once we have all our buttons all customized, we can now begin to work on memory recall. And this is a great way to recall certain settings fast without having to go through and change all the individual menu settings. For example, we can have 4K 24 in memory recall 1, 4K 60 in memory recall 2, and 1080p 120 in memory recall 3. Now, the reason why we want to have all of our customization down first is because once we save certain settings to a memory recall slot, it actually saves the entire camera profile as well. So for example, if one day you decide to change a certain custom button, but then switch to a memory recall profile, the custom button you just changed doesn't get applied to a memory recall slot because the memory recall pulls from the state that you've had the camera in when you've programmed it. So just keep that in mind. If you change the way that you're shooting, you will likely need to redo your memory recall profiles. But what's great about the memory recall on the A7 IV specifically is that we have 3 memory recall slots for each of the different modes, rather than all the modes sharing just 3 slots, like on the previous A7 III. So for photo, we have 3, video, we have 3, S&Q, we have 3. So I'm just gonna walk you through how to do a couple, just so you get the idea, and then you can set up the memory recall profiles to how you want it if you choose to use it. So let's do S&Q and set up 4K 60 slow motion. Flip over to S&Q on the dial and head to the menu. We'll go to File Format and make sure we are in XAVC HS 4K, and then come down to S&Q settings. Record frame rate is 24, frame rate is 60, record setting is 100M 420 10-bit. Come back out to the shooting display and set your shutter speed, 1/125. Aperture is f2.8, which is my lens's default right now, and ISO on auto. Now I'm choosing to use spot focus large at the center, autofocus is on continuous, white balance at 5600, standard creative profile, no picture profile, and standard stabilization. Autofocus speed and sensitivity at 5 and 5, and it looks like I have face and eye autofocus on, and that's okay. Once I think I'm good here, I'm gonna go to the menu, come down to shooting mode, MR camera set memory, and I'm gonna enter it into the first profile. Now, when I switch to 1 while I'm in S and Q on the dial, it will always pull up these exact settings. Now, let's set up S and Q for time lapse. Go back to manual mode, go to S and Q settings, record frame rate 24, but now the frame rate itself is gonna be 2 frames per second. Record settings remains the same. Coming back out to the shooting display, for shutter speed, I'm gonna go 1/50. Aperture, I'm gonna go f8. ISO on auto. And for focus, we're gonna go manual focus for this because I don't want the focus to constantly change while we're doing a time lapse. So we wanna make sure right at the start, we're manually grabbing focus on the main subject of interest first before we hit that record button. White balance, 5600K, standard color profile, no picture profile, and I'm actually gonna turn off stabilization for this one. You don't want the IBIS to accidentally ruin your shot. And I think that's it for the main settings. So we're gonna go to the menu now, shooting mode, camera set memory, and we're gonna enter it into our second profile. So now my memory recall 1 has my 4K 60 slow motion settings, and my memory recall 2 has my 4K 2 frames per second time lapse settings. When we get into a memory recall profile, it will pull up these exact settings that we've programmed, and we can actually make any changes to any of the settings while we're inside of those profiles. But once we exit out of a memory recall profile, it will revert back to the settings that we programmed initially. Now, just a quick heads up. When you get into doing memory recall for video, you gotta remember to take the audio input level into consideration. To play it safe, I recommend just having it on 7. At the very least, if your audio is too quiet, you can make it louder in post rather than it being too loud and it's beyond saving. And last but not least is the MyMenu settings. Now, I personally don't use this because I'm a Sony menu pro, as you can tell from this video. Nah, I'm just messing with you. I'm kidding. But this is really easy to set up, and it's really handy if you find yourself always lost in the menu for that one specific setting. You just have to click on Add Item, find the settings that you're looking for, and add it to one of the My Menu pages. And that's it. You can customize it to however you like. And if you want My Menu to show up first when you hit the menu button, just make sure to turn on Display from My Menu. Whoo-wee, my goodness. Did you make it to the end of the video? Did you just literally spend an hour with me? Bro, you're amazing. Let me know that in the comments down below. And hey, don't forget to give this video a like. Thank you so much for watching this video. And hey, I hope the Sony a7 IV serves you well. As I learn more about the camera, I will share what I discovered here on my YouTube channel. So subscribe if you haven't already yet, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Pew, pew. Peace.